Chapter 9 of Peggy's Trial by Mary Knight Potter. Recording by Leanne Howlett. Running away from home. Having thus impressed the boys, she easily persuaded them to go with her that very afternoon. Their first preparation was to break open their banks. Peggy took the coppers and silver pieces and tied them up into a handkerchief and put the handkerchief into the bottom of a small bag. "I had $2.16, she said. "Ted $1.93 and Harry 84 cents. That is more than enough to pay our fare to Scranton because tickets are only half a dollar." On top of the money she put the pieces of luncheon the boys had saved, first done up, however, in a newspaper. Just as they were about ready to leave the house, they heard their father drive up and the door slam after him as he came hurrying in. Very quietly they slipped down the back stairs, where a whispered conversation took place in the hall. The boys wanted to go to the office to say good-bye. Peggy's own heart was very full. She would have given anything for a kiss and hug from the father she adored. But she was afraid if they went in they would never get away. And then the stepmother would arrive and all the awful things she had read and heard about would commence. She therefore prevailed upon the other two not to stop. "We'll say good-bye to him through the window," she said. Out of the door, around the porch, up the piazza steps they crept and gazed through the long French window. Dr. Clayton was standing with his back to the fireplace reading a letter. Peggy looked till a blinding mist swept over her eyes. "Good-bye, dear Daddy," she said under her breath. She thought to herself that if he could see the three faces peering at him so sorrowfully, he would be tempted to give up the stepmother and keep his children. They were a decidedly subdued trio as they passed out of the front gate and turned into a side street. This led to the station, and they kept along for some time without saying a word. Ted was on one side of Peggy and Harry on the other. Somehow, though usually they would have scorned such a proceeding, each held one of her hands. "Is it very long to the station?" Harry's voice had a suspicious tremor. "Why, no," said Peggy briskly. "It took an awful little while to go in the buggy the other day. Seems if we must be pretty near it now." The truth was the Perrytown station was over 2 miles from Dr. Clayton's house. As none of the children had ever walked there, they did not realize its distance. For a few minutes longer they walked on, no one saying anything. Then, without a word of warning, Harry suddenly dropped down onto the snow by the side of the fence and began to cry bitterly. "I'm not going away from Father," he sobbed. "I don't want to go to Mrs. Baker's. I want to go home." Peggy sat down beside him and took his hand. All her efforts to comfort and encourage him had not the slightest effect. He wanted his father, he moaned, and he didn't believe his father would let a stepmother treat him badly. Here Teddy, who had been standing by in deep thought, swallowed hard twice. "Peggy," he said slowly, without looking at her, "that's just what I think. I don't believe Father will let anybody be mean to us. You know he doesn't allow even Nurse to whip us. And when she puts us to bed, why," he blushed shamefacedly, "I guess we need it. I've been thinking we aren't always very nice to Nurse." Peggy stood up and stared at them both with a mixture of dread and anger in her eyes. "Do you mean you aren't going with me after all?" At that Harry began to cry harder than ever. "Don't you go and leave us, Peggy. Let's all go home and take care of each other." There was deep scorn in Peggy's voice as she answered, "I'm not a baby if you are. I'm not going to be beaten and banged and starved by any old stepmother. You needn't think Father will be able to prevent it either," she added. "'Tisn't that he is mean, but he just can't help himself if a wicked woman makes him." "I don't believe," said Teddy staunchly, "that my father will have anything to do with a wicked woman. If he does marry a stepmother, I don't believe she will be so horrid." "Anybody would be horrid," wailed Peggy. "Who would come and take our own dear mother's place away from her?" But the boys had not the clear remembrance of their mother that Peggy had. Thus this side of the case did not strike them as it did her. Besides, home was home and father was father. The possible future stepmother did not seem half so real and terrible as the loss of these two. And also the station was a long way off. "Very well," said Peggy sternly at length. "You can go back if you want to. I shall keep straight on. If you want to leave me alone, you can." The boys begged and pleaded with her, but she resolutely refused to turn. Poor Harry cried as if his heart would break at the thought of leaving her. Perhaps in the end both boys might have gone with her, but suddenly Teddy had a bright thought. While Peggy was diving into the bottom of the bag for the roll of money, he whispered to Harry. "Don't worry," he said. "Father will bring her back, sure. She will be home this very night, see if she isn't." "Here," said Peggy as she pulled out the handkerchief bundle. "Here's your money." Neither boy would touch it. "You can send it to us," said Ted, "if you don't need it." They were saving every penny for a camera and Peggy knew it. She was therefore much impressed by their generosity. Leaving her in the lurch seemed less heartless after that. Very slowly the two walked back, turning many times before they reached the bend that hid them from sight. By that time the cheeks of both boys were wet with splashing tears. Only their faith that their father would come at once after Peggy prevented them from joining her again. Meanwhile Peggy gazed after them till the big lump in her throat grew and grew. When the most desperate straining of eyes failed to see even so much as a bit of a familiar hat or coat tail, she sank down on the snow. She had kept very brave and firm before them, but now the lump in her throat seemed to have a string connected with the cords of her heart. The hurt of the pull was alone enough to make a body cry. That was the excuse this small girl made to herself as she finally wiped away the last of the salt water that was all over her face. Pretty soon, beginning to feel hungry, she ate some of Harry's gingerbread. "Oh dear," she said to herself in dismay as she took the last bite. "I forgot to tell them not to let anyone know where I am. Somebody will be sure to come for me before I can reach the station." She remembered, however, that Nurse was to be out that afternoon. Also that the doctor usually did not come in much before tea. In that case she would be able to get to the train before anyone started after her. Once in Scranton, she believed she would be safe. So she plodded on as fast as she could go. Every little while she heard a horse coming up the street. Each time she waited in terror lest it should be someone for her. But the few sleighs that went jingling by held only strangers. No one noticed the little figure in the warm ulster with the bag and muff. By and by the houses got much farther apart. Then came an immense stretch of pasture land. This was the beginning of a farm that continued for an interminable space. Peggy had entirely forgotten this whole locality. The path seemed strangely wild and unfamiliar to her, and she almost feared she had lost her way. Still, she felt very sure she had not passed any other road, so she kept bravely on. By this time she was getting sadly tired. Her long tramp in the morning, combined with the deep mental strain and excitement, were making this last pilgrimage altogether too much for her strength. It was cold, too, she thought as she hugged her muff tighter. And what a wilderness of nothing but snow! Wasn't she ever going to see a house any more? And where, oh where was that station? It seemed as if she must already have gone more than 3 times the distance. Ted and Harry, she thought, had got home long before this. Evidently they had found no one at the house. That, of course, was just what she hoped would happen. Yet queerly enough it made her feel very forlorn and choky. "You are as big a baby as the boys," she said to herself in disgust. "Have you forgotten stepmother?" The thought made her hasten her lagging footsteps. But how tired she was! She found it harder and harder work to move her feet at all. Suddenly she realized that the daylight was all gone. The short winter twilight had commenced and soon now it would be night. So far as she could see there was nothing ahead of her. Nothing but wide white fields, broken here and there by a clump of bare brown bushes or a few tall naked trees. There was no place to rest. She could only keep on, hoping every minute that some turn would show the railroad station. For what seemed to her more than an hour she stumbled ahead, every step slower and more dragging than the one before. Presently she stopped with a frightened gasp. There was no longer even any twilight. Night had already begun. Then Peggy's brave heart failed her. For the first time she felt thoroughly frightened. She shuddered at each mound of snow and every dark shrub. All the demons and ogres and wicked sprites she had read of in fairy books seemed lurking on every side. She was mortally afraid to go ahead, and she was altogether too scared to go back. Just as the last bit of her strength was about gone, the road took an unexpected turn about a thick growth of trees. There on the other side was a big barn or shed. Peggy could see no house near, and there was nothing homelike or inviting in the big blank wall before her. To the cold, frightened, worn-out child, however, it was like a very haven of rest and safety. If only she could get in! The big sliding door was pulled to and beyond her strength to open. Beside it, however, was a small one, and to her delight she found it unfastened. Once inside, the deep gloom and impenetrable corners were almost as fearsome as the night without. For a few minutes she stood hesitating, not daring to move. Gradually her eyes got slightly more used to the dim interior. What was that great big black thing over in the corner opposite? She stared and stared, hardly breathing. Presently she gave a glad cry. She knew where she was now and the deadly fear was all gone. For that tall, wide shape was old Mr. Haskell's barouche. Peggy had ridden in it too many times not to know it now. She did not stop to wonder how she had come to this barn, which was not at all on the road to the station. She only felt as if that old barouche meant home and comfort. Mr. Haskell's house must be somewhere near, she knew, but she was too tired to try to find it. In the carriage was a big buffalo robe, and under that she crawled, and in 2 minutes she was fast asleep. End of Chapter 9. Chapter 10 of Peggy's Trial by Mary Knight Potter. Recording by Leanne Howlett. The Rescue and Return. During this time Ted and Harry had gone forlornly home. As Peggy supposed, they found there neither nurse nor father. It was nearly 6 o'clock when the doctor arrived. In a very few minutes his two unhappy, excited boys had told him the day's troubles. "You got here at 3 o'clock?" he exclaimed in dismay. "She must have taken the 4:30 train for Scranton then." Without stopping for any more particulars, he rang up the station master on the telephone. Peggy, came the reply, had not been seen there at all. She must be lost then, thought the doctor. But to be lost in Perrytown was much less terrible than to be wandering the streets of a city like Scranton. Jim was ordered back with the horse and sleigh, and with 2 lighted lanterns they set out on a search. They drove rapidly down the street Peggy had first taken. Here they hardly looked at all. Before long, however, the road to the station swung off to the left. The main highway, on the contrary, kept straight on, and here was where Dr. Clayton thought Peggy might have made a mistake. With a lantern in each hand, he got out and examined the tracks in the snow on both sides. Finally, on the main road, he found some small footprints, and beside one of them a few big crumbs of gingerbread. This decided him to try that direction first. Every once in a while they saw the small prints in the snow, and at last they came to Mr. Haskell's barn. The tracks led up to the little door. With his heart beating a hard tattoo, Dr. Clayton picked up a lantern and jumped before the horse had stopped. At first, like Peggy, he saw nothing but deep shadows. Then the light from the lantern fell full upon the barouche. A few wide strides brought the doctor beside it, and there, curled up in the furry robe, was Peggy, fast asleep. The gleams from the lantern showed a very pale little face where the tears had scarcely yet dried. Her father leaned over her tenderly with a big gulp in his throat. Very gently he lifted the robe and then with great care picked up the sleeping child. She stirred uneasily a moment, but the day had been too hard for anything much short of a bomb to waken her now. Sound asleep in his arms she stayed till they entered their own front door. Ted and Harry, who had been waiting in a very fever of anxiety, rushed out into the hall. Before they could be hushed, their wild hurrahs succeeded in reaching even Peggy's sleeping ears. While she was still only half conscious, her father carried her into the office and shut the boys out. Peggy's first thought, when she was once fairly awake, was one of surprise at finding herself on the office couch. Generally, when she woke up, it was in her own little room. Generally, too, it was morning. Now the lighted lamps showed it must be night. She turned over perplexedly and lifted herself up by her elbow. Then she saw her father sitting beside her. "Hello, Daddy," she smiled sleepily. "How did I get here?" For the moment she had entirely forgotten all the day's experiences. Instead of answering, Dr. Clayton bent and kissed her, took her up in his arms, and sat down in a big chair before the open fire. By that time she was beginning to remember. "Why," she said hesitatingly, "I was in Mr. Haskell's barn and I ran away. Oh," she started up with a gasp, "has the stepmother come?" "Peggy." There was something in her father's tone that quieted her at once. "For how many years have you been my little daughter?" "I'll be 11 next May," she answered softly. "How many times in those years has father beaten you?" "Why, never." Peggy snuggled closer to him. "What has he ever done to show that he hated any of his children?" "Never done anything." Peggy's face was flame color, but she looked squarely into her father's eyes. "Do you think he loves you all or not?" Dr. Clayton's tone was very deep and tender, and the child's heart began to beat painfully. "I know you love us dearly," she whispered, "and I didn't run away from you, Daddy. I was afraid of the stepmother." "Peggy, if I love my children, how could I let anyone else be bad to them?" But, her voice was broken. "But nurse says all stepmothers are bad, and Cora May's grandmother told her they make fathers hate their children." Dr. Clayton smoothed back Peggy's rumpled hair. "If that was true, little maid, what kind of a father would I be if I ever let a stepmother come near you?" Peggy choked. "Nurse and everybody says you are going to marry a stepmother and nobody could be nice who would take my own dear mother's place away from her." It had all come out in a burst. A deep flush spread over her father's face. For a minute he stared at the fire without speaking. Then he turned his eyes to Peggy's wretched little countenance, and he smiled tenderly. End of chapter 10.